Good.
Oh, I don't know what happened there. Screen is stop. Share window is closed. Okay, let's try this again. What happened there? Okay.
Your screen share went away.
Yeah, I got to for some reason the PowerPoint just stopped. When you know what? Okay. Sorry, I got to pull up my screen. I had a little internet interruption here in my hotel, I guess. Uh, so just give me a minute.
And there are people on YouTube watching already, so
Okay,
good
just
morning,
I
everybody.
ran a little bit of a technical problem here. It should be about 30 seconds to get back up here.
Okay.
I'm at a hotel room right now, and every once in a while the internet goes off. You got to re-sign back in. Excuse me. Okay. Almost there. I'm usually slow here. Okay. All right. Okay. I'll try the share screen again. You see?
Almost.
Okay.
There it is.
You can see everything okay now?
It's good.
Really apologize, everybody. About 5 minutes late here, but welcome, thank you. This is the Covenant Code. It's a new series. This is part two. The title, it's about time, but it's part two of the Covenant Code. Last week was the introduction and part one. This same place, you can see it every week. Excuse me, at 10 o'clock Pacific time. Also on the YouTube and the other places located there. So the Covenant Code is a new evangelistic series that began last week and features a weekly study of the biblical book of Revelation from the perspective of observations made for our generation. So this is, I guess, a little bit of back up here for a second, but we did an introduction of why we're studying, why we're looking at the tabernacle, why we're studying the book of Revelation, why our generation is to watch. And we went through that last week. And then we did a little bit of an overview that was kind of like taking a drink from a fire hose, showing this, 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 this. So just sort of giving an introduction to the series. But now we're going to kind of start to lay the foundation. And one of the things we talked about last week was this 4,140 years. And so basically, I'm going to talk about time this week, and we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into it. And I want to use two scriptures. First one, they're both from Peter. One's from First Peter. It says, always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks for a reason regarding the hope that is in you. Yet answer with gentleness and reverence, having a good conscience, that whereas they speak ill of you as of evildoers, they may be ashamed that falsely accuse your good conversation in Christ. So sometimes people ask you a question, and it's they assume that you have evil intents, but if you have genuine intents and you're able to just answer the question for them, then that's what you're supposed to do. And so every time I've given little bits and pieces of the series, I start talking about some of the numbers in the pattern. Somebody always naturally asks, well, where did you get those numbers from? And the truth is, I actually, and I'll get into that testimony maybe next time, but I actually got those numbers from the Bible first through this tabernacle pattern before I really understood what they meant. This 4140 kept coming up, as well as 1656 and 2484, and I never really understood it. So I never, I ended up wanting to know where this 4140 was. I knew that people, had talked at that time about it's about 4,000 years from Adam to Jesus. So I thought, well, 4140, maybe that's the year that the book of Revelation was written or whatever. So I actually went back and studied the timeline after I'd already seen the number in the pattern. But I want to show you sort of a little bit of a background on time and where you actually derive that number. There's a second scripture, which is going to talk really about part three, which will be next week. We also have a sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well that you take heed as to unto light that shineth in the dark place until day dawn, and the day star rise in your hearts. Next week, I want to show you from the pattern itself where the number comes from. This week, I want to show you really from observations and time that we can all make. So what is time, or what time is it? Time is an agreed unit of observable measurement from one event to another from the perspective of the observer. In science, they say it's the fourth dimension of space-time. So you have, I think of it like if you draw a line, you have this dimension. If you pull it up, you have two dimensions. If you stretch it out, you have three dimensions. So that's space. But then time is when, so for example, in the beginning, that's where you add a fourth dimension to space and you have space-time. But imagine if there was no agreed measure of time as of right now. How would you understand and communicate time to others? So in other words, this meeting starts at 10 o'clock Pacific time. How would you know when that was? how can we schedule that? How would you schedule meeting up with somebody if there's no time that's agreed upon? You need to have this agreed upon time. Um, there is a gentleman, a down and out guy that I used to pass by every day, and he was homeless, and so I would start off dropping water, and then I'd drop off some food and things like that. And after a while, just asked him if there's any more I could do for him. Just I was bringing him food and water, and I kind of just wanted to help him out a little bit more. And I thought he might ask for a new pair of shoes, or might ask for something, a blanket, a coat, or something more. And he said, "I'd really like a watch. If you could get me a watch with a big, like a cheap watch at Walmart or something with the big numbers on it. I just really want to be able to know what time it is." And, and on top of that, if you have extra, maybe you could buy me a cheap set of glasses at Walmart too. So when you lose track of time and you're out of the rest of society, it's just something that we need. Time is just we kind of need to know where we're at in order to. I mean, imagine the world right now if there was no agreed upon time. So at the very beginning, going to do a little bit of a brief history of time. This is, and God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years." So we have the first measurements, agreeable measurements of time, days, which is period of darkness and a period of light, and together they're called one's a day and a night, but together they're called a day. So that's an agreed upon unit of time. We have the week because in 6 days of God's creation, the seventh day was a rest. So day and week and year are the oldest measurements of time. But what's interesting is that day, week, and year are observed through observing the apparent movement of the celestial bodies, or sort of day and year are. A week is by God's word. The only reason we observe a 7 day week is because it was given in His word. So and it doesn't matter whether it falls in the middle of the month. Um, you know, seventh day is the seventh day. And it's actually the longest unit of time outside of day in history. And there's been a lot of people as well. There's a week where the Romans had an 8 day week, and others had 6 day weeks, and but the seventh day Sabbath is one of the longest to read about time. And now the whole world is on a 7 day week. You know, one one of the things I said about this series is it's so important for us in our generation to watch, in our generation to go back and study, because you could have said a week, you know, 500 BC, and people might have thought different days. Oh, is that 7 days or 8 days? Is that 6 days? But the closer you get to our generation, the better our understanding is of time. And through that understanding, when we go back and look at the tabernacle, we see things clearer in a different way that I'm so excited to share with you. But so after thousands of years of observations of celestial bodies, man increasingly learned to measure time. 1500 BC, the Egyptians had developed an advanced sundial. It was calibrated so that basically every um, hour the sun moves across the plane of the sky 15 degrees. So in the daylight, they could measure time. And then they started to create mechanical ways of, like with water clocks and things like that, where it would ease out over a certain period of time. So at night, they could kind of measure that same 12 hours. Of course, they also knew how to read the stars and things like that. But so, 1500 BC, man's getting increasingly more aware of time. Um, by the time of Moses, they had divided the Egyptians, Babylonians, and the Israelites because they were given time to observe too. Divided the year by either solar cycles or lunar cycles, and what became known now as months. So now we have a month. We got a day, a year, a week, a month. The idea of a minute and a second wasn't around. I mean, first of all, the whole idea of the word minute and second didn't come around till 150 AD. And that was really more for astronomy and for geology, taking the 360-degree circle and dividing it into another 60 part. And the first division was called a first minute. And then dividing it by 60 again, it was called a second minute. So that became the term minute and second. But it didn't really become part of timekeeping till about 400 years ago. So we had minutes and seconds, but so now we're all the way up to about 1600 before we were using these terms. So as I said, as we observe more and get closer more in time, man gets more and more able to measure time. Only in 1967 did science define it as a second, and we went from an international system of units to a coordinated universal time. And they defined scientifically an atomic, sort of seconds. And so now minutes, hours, years, months are defined by this basic unit of a second. But I'm just showing you that that's only 1967. So that time, the whole world is in agreement of how long is a second, how long is a minute, et cetera, et cetera. Um, when at the time of Jesus and the disciples, and about 46 BC, they introduced the Julian calendar, and that corrected a whole bunch of problems. But it was based on a 365.25 day year. And how do they do the 0.25? Well, every 4 years it had an extra day, a leap year, or whatever. And that was the calendar that time. That's was man's best observation after all the observations of the Egyptians and the Babylonians, and then the Romans, of course, just took over that knowledge. So, but because of that slight imprecision, that very small imprecision, then it started to drift because the faithful witnesses in the sky don't change, at least not very much, and so all of a sudden the days started to not fall where they should in terms of the seasons. So in 1582, Pope Gregory instituted the Gregorian calendar. And what happened was, and of course, the Catholics, some states, were part of the Holy Roman Empire, etc. So the Catholic states were first to adopt it, but basically it went from Thursday, October 4th, 1582, was followed by Friday, October 15th, 1582. And it caused quite an uproar. I mean, imagine tomorrow, you know, the date's not December, 22nd or whatever. It's January 3rd. It's like, what? What happened? But the world didn't adopt it right away. In fact, it took the United Kingdom till 1752. It took China till 1912, Russia 1918, Greece 1923, Saudi Arabia 2010. So now that you finally have the world in agreement with a calendar year, but I just want to show you that it's a slow progression. It didn't happen like overnight. We've learned more and more and more about observing time and agreeing on time, and it says how can two walk together unless you're agreed? So if we're going to measure time, we're going to talk about a year or a month or a day or whatever. I just want to show that in our generation, there's more agreement than there ever has been on time, and we've become better at measuring literal time. And we start talking about calendars and those, more religious based, more biblical based. And in 160 AD, there was this Siddur Olam Rabbah, this new chronology that basically is where the Jewish year today is based on. And at that time, the calculation was that from Adam at creation to to uh, basically zero, BC was 3,761 years. And in this timeline, they had the first temple, and of course they don't use BC or whatever. We'll talk about it later on. But the first temple was destroyed in 422 BC, and um, and the second, the Roman, was 68 AD, and that added up to the 490 years of Daniel's prophecy. So basically, it shifted away from the Messiah to the destruction of these two temples. That's this is what Dan is referring to. However, through archaeology and things like that, we found since then the real date of the destruction of the temple was 587, 586 BC, and 70 AD. So that period of time was called the missing years of the calendar. But it's not just that; there's other ones too. But that's kind of the big chunk. And it really is the Jewish scholars in 1500 started recognizing that the traditional Hebrew dating is not historically precise. The One of the more recent Shimon Shoah interpreted the biblical words, seal the words and close the book, as a commandment to obscure the biblical chronology so that it would not be possible to accurately calculate the time of the Messiah's arrival. Thus, according to Schwab, the traditional Jewish calendar intentionally omitted years from the Persian period. However, Schwab later withdrew that suggestion for obvious reasons. So, but nobody knows because what they were trying to do was introduce the new era for the Pharisees and the new and what became Judaism and the new the Talmud and the and have authority over the Bible, the oral, going from the written Bible to the oral, and having a year like 4,000 years would be a good year to issue that in. But we don't know whether the person that actually wrote that, um, because that was written in 160, it wasn't introduced till a little bit after that. So was that edited by somebody else? Was that chopped out to make, because it ended up in that time period, and the the missing kings and stuff like that, would be pretty obvious. Went from 200 and something years to 40 something years. So long story short is that if you add all the missing years that have been calculated since, the calendar today would, the Hebrew calendar is 5784. Right now it's 5784. But when you add them all in, it's really 6137. So if you think taking 11 days and saying, oh, now it's here, imagine taking hundreds of years and adding it to your calendar. So even though Jewish scholars have recognized this since the 1500s, it hasn't changed the clock because you'll never get something like that done. There's always going to be disagreements and et cetera. But I'm saying the good thing about that is it's the Jewish scholars that said, hey, there's something not precise here, and they keep trying to find, and they don't hide it. They say, look, there's some missing years, and so we don't know the motivations back then. We don't know what it is. We know that it obscured things, so people couldn't figure out, that time of the Messiah, but we don't know why that is, or what, if that was even the reason. All we know is that it was off. It was missing at the time that they did it. And later on, it was the Hebrew scholars that said, you know what, we're missing some years here, quite a few years. So, and I point that out because a lot of the biblical chronologies were based on that timeline. They're based on, well, how's that compare to this, to Christian biblical chronology. Um, Probably the best known chronology was one by James Ussher. That was in 1650 AD. And he was a archbishop heading over, I think it was Ireland, and he had estimated Adam's creation at 404 BC. And he did things like, for example, he fixed the birth of Jesus because um, archaeological records had already come up, and Joseph had confirmed that the death of Herod was in 4 BC. So Jesus had to be somewhere before 4 BC, and based on all his work, he said, 5 BC. But what he did too was he corrected, like, now, how would Jesus be born 4 years before Christ? Well, because that's that calendar drift we talked about. The Roman calendar going to the Gregorian calendar, and then understanding better as time goes on. But you want to be accurate, so they didn't change it to zero. It's like 4 BC, but those numbers have stayed the same. But our understanding has gotten better. By the 1900s, his chronology started to suffer criticism, and for example, some of the kings list, even on the Hebrew kings and stuff like that. But it's an honorable effort for its time. And when you ridicule something like that, it's kind of mindless, kind of small-mindedness, because you're using present criteria to judge a distant and different past. So Usher represented the best of scholarship in his time. He was part of a substantial research tradition of intellectuals working toward a common goal under an accepted methodology. The Bible didn't change. Whenever we're talking about chronologies, whether it's the Hebrew, whether it's Christian, whatever, the Bible doesn't change. The words are the same. Someone is just trying to reconcile that with what they know about time, or what they know about, historic events, or whatever. So as man became more and more aware through archaeology, through other of these records, then times adjust. The Bible didn't adjust, but men started to understand a little bit. Okay, well, it wasn't 3,700 years like the Hebrew calendar. This is 4,004 years. It's a little bit longer than that. So in his time, his is one of the best. In fact, after him, after 1650, most of the Bibles had in the margins his dates. So different events were based on Usher's work. So the main thing, and I didn't realize how big a controversy it was a long time ago when I first studied out timelines myself, is what they call this apparent gap in the biblical chronology from the death of Joseph to the birth of Moses. Because up until the death of Joseph, it's very straightforward, because it talks about the father, the son, how many years, etc. So you follow this line through genealogy. Well, there isn't that direct line from Joseph to Moses at the Exodus. I'll get back to that later on, but because of that, and because of a couple other things we're going to share, the reading of the chronology of the Israelites, Exodus from Egypt, there were two major theories. Either the Israelites sojourned in the land of Egypt for a total of 430 years, or else 215 years in Egypt and 215 in Canaan. Each can be shown to be valid as far as possibility is concerned. The 215 year is the least evidence in terms of literal interpretation of biblical chronology, but they can both be shown to be valid. And I just want to walk through it a little bit. um, so in Exodus 12, 40, 41, and 42, it reads, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel," this is what Moses wrote, "who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the self same day it came to pass, that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night to be much observed unto the Lord for bringing them out from the land of Egypt. This is the night of the Lord to be observed of all the children of Israel in their generations." And soon Moses would receive the pattern for the tabernacle, and that night was kept as the Passover. the first feast outside of the Sabbath. So it was a very celebrated day. It was to be observed. And this was the self same day, 430 years. That's what Moses is saying here. Only in the Septuagint, which is, we'll get into it in a minute, but it records a variation. In verse 40, it says, the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan. So that's where we start to get, okay, is it just in Egypt or Egypt and the land of Canaan? So that's the LXX text. The Masoretic text, the MT, is the authoritative Hebrew and Aramaic text of the Hebrew Bible. So it's the one used in the Hebrew Bible today. It's also the basis for most of the Protestant translations of the Old Testament, King James, English Standard, New American Standard, NIV, etc., and for some Catholic Bibles, New American, New Jerusalem, etc. So the MT doesn't have the and the land of Canaan. It only has the 430 years self same day. So the Septuagint is a translation from Hebrew to Greek about the 2nd century BC. But there's numerous examples of attempts to help the Word of God fix apparent issues or to boost the nation of Israel's standing with the Greeks. Basically, there were 70 elders, or some say 72, that were to translate it into Greek, the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Now, the Greeks, of course, wrongfully boasted of being the oldest generations, and if you're the oldest people, then you must be the greatest people. So their ancestors went back tens of thousands of years, and of course later on millions of years or whatever. So part of the Hebrews translating to Greek, part of that pressure at that time was, well, who are you guys? Who are the Hebrews? Well, in the genealogies just in Genesis, they add 1,500 years to the genealogies. So when people say, well, I want to use the LXX, the Septuagint, to use this 215-year plan, then if you're going to use the 215 year from there and Canaan, then you should also have to use the 1,500 extra years for the same book, which would put creation back about 5,700 BC. See, and it has problems like but you start fudging with numbers in the Bible, they have Methuselah living until 14 years after the flood in that same genealogy. Now remember, Methuselah means when he dies, it will come. I mean, if I had a friend named Methuselah, or even if he was my next door neighbor, and I knew that his name meant when he dies, it will come. Man, if that guy got a cold, I'd be running over there. Hey, like some vitamin C? And can I get you anything? I mean, so to have him die in 14 years, so Noah's got to say to his great grandfather, sorry, no room for you on the ark. Oh, and by the way, you're the only one that's going to survive that's not in the ark. You're going to tread water or something. Like, it doesn't make sense. So you can't pick and choose. And what you're doing is shooting an arrow and then drawing a bullseye around it. I want to use a 4,000-year timeline because that's what tradition is. So I'm going to use this text out of this one, but I'm going to use the genealogy out of that one, and I'm going to massage all this stuff. So I'm just saying, that there's issues with that, and that's why there's been such an argument back and forth. Now, there's other texts that we're going to talk about that aren't controversial, that are in both texts. So the one that's used most often is Paul in Galatians 3:16 and 17. And I'll read Paul's first. It says, now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He hath not said, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. So he's talking about whether the promise came first or the law. You see, the promise came first, and then he says, and I say this, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ. So Christ is the one that confirmed this covenant. The law which was 430 years after, cannot disannul, that it should make the promise of none effect. I want to read you exactly what happened to that thing. This is from Genesis 15:13. And I want you to hear it, in exactly as it says. The Lord, he's saying, and he said unto Abraham, know of surety. Now remember, where is he saying this? This is the land that he said, I will show you. He's in Canaan, which is the promised land that became, the nation of Israel. So he's in Canaan at this time that this is being spoken. Know of surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge. And afterwards they shall come out, where? Of that nation, with what? Great substance, as in the Exodus. And thou shalt go to the talking to Abraham to thy father in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But the fourth generation shall come back hither, or hither again. So we're in Canaan, they're gonna go to a land, they're gonna come out with great substance, and they're gonna come back here. So when you say Canaan and Egypt, so when you look at this Galatians 3 thing, think of it in this term. Paul is talking about that covenant, this very covenant, being confirmed in Christ. Christ is the seed that all nations be blessed from. So he's saying this is confirmed in Christ. Well, 430 years exactly, if you go by the 430-year chronology, is when that seed of Abraham entered Jerusalem. That was the ninth year of um, Joseph being second in command. When Israel or Jacob came in at 130 years old, from there to that same days that 430-year chronology is when is referenced. I'm showing you something, and people might be arguing and upset right now, but don't worry, I'm going to come back and be very fair. But see this painting on the right? It's kind of hard to depict it because it's a huge mural on a tomb, and it's well dated. It's 1870, 1885 to, sorry, 18, yeah, I think 1885, 86. But it's I got it on my next slide. But anyway, it's we know that date because of historical records about what this event is all about and when they came. This is the Semitic people coming and bringing gifts into Egypt. So it's depicted on a wall of a tomb, and it reflects the time of Jacob and Joseph. If you use the 215-year period, it has to be Abraham coming in. If you use the 430, then it's exactly to the day Joseph coming in. This one entered Egypt in the ninth year of Joseph's leadership, exactly 430 years before the Exodus. There's no gap. So you have the entrance of into Egypt. You have the death of Jacob 17 years later, death of Joseph. This period to here is exactly 430 years. Now, so there's different things archaeologically and everything else you can go back into. So so we've talked about different commentaries. One of the best commentaries, and there's lots of really good ones, but one of the best commentaries is the SCA commentary. And this Advances commentary is full of pretty incredible stuff. So first of all, let's talk about Ellen White, because, like I said, when I talk about 4,140 years, blah blah, then this will usually come up. But so the first statement says, the Lord revealed this to Abraham about 400 years before it was fulfilled. So that seems to support the 215-year sojourn. But the next statement says, for 400 years they had been in Egypt and had been in slavery to the Egyptians. In fact, out of all the statements she makes, and she makes quite a few, all the ones for 200 that seem to support 215 year sojourn were made from 1864 to 1891. The statements that appeared to support 430 years were between 1894 and 1904. People say, well, how could she support both, both things? Because an inspirational, like a prophet or someone speaking in inspiration, if they're writing, it can also be a scholar. For example, when Paul says the 430 years, it was 403 years, did he get a vision that was 430 years? Did Paul have some, or as a scholar and what he had been trained for? I mean, remember, he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He got that number from somewhere else. So but he's speaking, the inspirational part of what he's speaking about is Christ fulfilled that covenant and he fulfilled it. The promise came before the law. That's the inspiration. Whether it's 430 years or whatever, is a scholarly, literary description. If he said hundreds of years, it wouldn't matter. But sometimes people get too hung up on, well, how could she say this before and then this after? Well, she had a library of 1,200 books with 4 different chronologies, well established ones. Usher, she seemed to favor the most. He had the shortest timeline, and he also had the 215 years. But there's others that she had as well, and and she expressed, on her, like I said, on different occasions, things that seem to support both. But this is, part of this. Like she's probably the most prolific Christian author ever, and part of your scholarly thing. And remember, the Bibles that she was looking at that time, all of them had Usher's timelines in the margins. So you have to recognize a little bit of both. Is that she's not boxed in one way or the other. She's not. She hasn't committed to say this. Some things seem more assured than others, but she definitely has a period of supporting each. So let's go to the commentary. So it was published less than 40 years after the passing of Ellen White, and it chose to defend the 215-year sojourn. So it referenced this 1885-86 mural painting, which is the one I showed you, as possibly Abraham entering. And like I said, there's some archaeological records that have come up since about the kings in Egypt at that time that kind of discredit that. It seems much more likely that it was Jacob coming into Israel. But they also talk in different parts about present truth and being open to later light, just like Ellen White. This is the present truth, open to later light. In 2020, there's an article you can Google yourself, Andrews University thesis. It's called A Complete Chronology of the Israelites in Egypt, a textual study of the length of the sojourn from a Seventh-day Adventist perspective by Matthew Bronson. One of the comments he makes is one of the people that did the 215 contributed to that commentary elsewhere expressed greater doubt about 215 years. But what he says, how he sums it up, and he shows both arguments, and they're both valid, and they both could be taken anyway. Today, Adventist scholars tend to feel that a mere 215 years in Egypt would make the multiplication of the Israelites reckoned in the Pentateuch an utter impossibility. So more and more favoring the 430 years. It doesn't say you have to favor one or you have to favor another. It's just saying that this is, what's just like with the Jewish chronologies where there's missing years. There's as we get more and more familiar with time and more records come up and things like that. Sometimes it makes it more and more challenging to stick with a certain position. This isn't a matter of salvation. This is just a matter of history and of time. And so, like I said, it's more of a scholarly thing than an inspirational thing. So this is the timeline that I did, and I did this years ago. But I was trying to. This is after I I'd seen on the pattern 4,140 years. I wanted to go back and see, where does where does all this these things come from? So I'll just give you a bit of a example here. So you start off, you obviously have the dates. The Bible moves forward in dates, and of course going back, BC. So, and this is how it's reconciled. So over here, birth of Seth, Genesis 5:3, birth of Enoch, 5:6. So you go through and you get to the 600 year of Noah, um, and that's 1656 from creation. You can go to pretty much any Bible, any and add up those genealogies and go to the Hebrew one. You're going to get the same 1656 years. It's really straightforward. There's no having to guess around on that one. And then you have the next group, and here's where you get into the 215 controversy. So the birth of Terah, and then birth of Abraham. If you take this the direct reading of it, then you would have these numbers over here. This is 70 years after Terah, um, and I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly, but you get the numbers just keep going, right? And then Isaac, Abraham died, Joseph born, Isaac died. Israel entered Egypt at 130 years of age. In going backwards time, that was 1876. Going forward time, 2238. And you keep going. Actually, I got to go to the next slide here. I'll take it off of this. And you keep going. I'll magnify this up a little bit too. So you have Moses born. Now we have like when the Exodus happened and things like it too, because there's just like Moses said, 430 years from Israel entering Egypt. You have texts going back to the temple and back to Solomon's reign, and say in the fourth year of Solomon, he began the temple, which was exactly 480 years from the Exodus, and we know the dates of the temple. So they all match up going forward and going back. But I'm just showing you that they don't just come willy-nilly from nowhere. They come from actual from the Bible, different texts, whatever. And as you go along, this was a really key event. So this is in yellow because it's a secular event. And so this is a known solar eclipse, which was done through NASA. This is the year it happened, 763. And these secular records helped with the Persian king list, which mentions different biblical people, to reconcile a lot of those dates too, to know exactly when these things happen. Then you have the fall of the tribes of Israel, Babylon, the last biblical prophet, Malachi, then other historical records like Alexander the Great conquering Egypt, etc. So when you add up that time to between 4 and 6 BC, you would get between 4108 and 4110 from creation. The 1 AD, because there's no zero, it goes from 1 BC to 1 AD, would be 4,114 years from creation. So the 27 AD would be 4,140 when the ministry of Jesus began. The temple being destroyed, 70 AD would be 4183. The book of Revelation or the Apocalypse, it would be 4209. So this, if you say to me, always have a answer for anyone who asks you, I would say that I've studied it, I've looked at the evidence, I've done my own timeline, and what I was thrilled when that number 4140 hits exactly the same year that that Daniel foretold the 69 times 7. But no matter what I said, and no matter how we could talk all night, Some people aren't only going to, not agree, they're going to get upset and they're going to argue and they're going to say, you can't, listen to this man or whatever. But I want to change gears here for a second. So time is an agreed unit of observable measurement from one event to another. Imagine if there's no agreed times. How can we walk together? You know, so we were never as close of an agreement on times than in our generation. Even if you take the Hebrew chronology, or you take Usher's chronology, or you take the SDA chronology, or you take the chronology I just showed you, they're they're close. They're close. And also, most people that are the scholars in those areas recognize former problems and lean more towards an agreement, lean more now towards agreement than they did 50 years ago. That's for sure. I mean, what I read to you from the Andrews University thesis was not my words. It was a professor's words saying that most of them, not them, most of the Adventist scholars believe more in the 430 years because of challenges that have come along that they have a harder time supporting. Ellen White picked both. But either way, it's, not all will agree because these are man's observations. And there's always going to be mistakes, and there's always going to be, things like, because these aren't inspirational. These are scholarly. There's going to be mistakes, or there's going to be arguments, whatever. And the good news about all that is, I don't want you to agree. I don't, because I never, this pattern came to me, and I didn't have a biblical timeline. I didn't have, and I'm going to share more of that as we get into it, but we're told to go observe the tabernacle in our time. From what we know about time, go back and observe the tabernacle. And I'm going to show you next week, if you never had a timeline, if all you had was a Bible, and you know what's good about that tabernacle pattern? It's in every translation. It's in the LX, it's in the Hebrew, it's in the MT, it's in the Catholic, it's in, because no one ever thought to change that. So if it says the dimensions 1.5 by 2.5, or 46 boards, or all those sort of things, it's the same in every single Bible. So when I'm talking to you about the pattern, you can look it up in your own Bible, whatever Bible you have. And you're looking at observations that we look at back now, and you go, okay, I'm looking at now from my perspective, whether you believe the 215 years or the 430. A little secret is that some people watching this right now think we're all nuts. 6,000 years? What are you talking about? You mean you're young earth creationists? I mean, you believe every word of the Bible? It's millions of years, billions of years. But the little surprise I have is after we do next week's lesson, showing the tabernacle predicting these times, then I'm going to talk about evolution for the next week and those timelines and that history, and do a deep dive there and show, well, what is the actual evidence there. And with that foundation made about time, then we'll start to build the tabernacle. So these are just kind of foundational things. And I'm doing it this way so that in the future, if somebody says, well, where do you get the 4,140 years? I can say, oh, just take the time to go back to part two. And if you want to see why that really doesn't matter, go to part three, and you'll see how the tabernacle foretold it all. It foretold Enoch, it foretold Noah, it foretold Abraham, Moses, David, Jesus, in such an incredible way. I can't wait to share it with you. So it's that, and you don't need to agree on timelines or that year or that year. And so I ended this off with saying, we also have a sure word of prophecy, whereunto you do well to heed as a light unto the dark place until the day dawn and the day start rising in your hearts. The tabernacle pattern talks about this atoning event, and that comes up at 4140. It's not 4,000 years. 40 or 400 or 4,000 is 6 times 6666666. When you get to those numbers, that is a time like 40 days and 40 nights, 40 years in the wilderness, 40 days. It's a time of man's backsliding, or times of man's like 6 times 6 6 6 6. It's an event. The time for mercy for that event and salvation for that event and reconciliation for that event comes just after, just a little bit beyond. And it's not 6 6 6 6 6. And that's what I want to show you in this pattern. So I'm just asking you to just to be patient. Why I'm doing it this way so we can walk step by step. It doesn't matter to me, and so you don't have to, what does matter to me is if, you make comments and say, all Meikle's timeline's off, blah, 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 because it might discourage others, so we may not agree on the timeline. We don't have to agree on that timeline. What you're going to see over and over and over and over is 4140 comes up in the tabernacle in its construction. And what's incredible about that is the year. And you'll see more and more. It's not just 40. I can show you without even doing the 4140, and just the time from Adam to Noah, just that 1656, you'll see the same pattern. It just continues. And you'll see the same thing with Enoch. Enoch's the seventh generation. You see when he was born, exactly when he was born, exactly how many years between when he was born and the flood. And you'll see it's the same pattern. It's so incredible that we go back. So everything we've learned about time, whether we know exactly how many, our chronology is right or not, we know a lot about time. And we have a world in agreement with how much time is in a year, a day, a month, in a secular way anyway. And so we can see things that other generations before went to. Like I said, at the time of Jesus and the apostles, there was no minute, there was no second, but we can see things in a like so. And there was no, and the calendar they're using at the time was off by enough to go out of drift, every year. So time at that time, all that we know for sure was in the beginning, God created, you know, and we know that He made a covenant and that He's going to fulfill that covenant through Christ. And my whole observation isn't to be right or wrong on a scholarly issue. I really don't care because that's not what I'm counting on. I'm counting on the prophetic, incredible prophetic testimony of the tabernacle. That's what my ministry is about, the covenant. It doesn't matter to me. I'm not going to jump in the middle of this heated debate about 215 or 430 years. I can show you why I believe it's 430 years and why others do, but that doesn't mean you have to believe that. And Jesus said, if you don't believe my words, believe my works, and seeing that there's this pattern that was given to Moses that he was told not to deviate from in any way, and seeing how the apostles said the pattern was from things from above, how God would act from above, that the shadow was a shadow, but the body was Christ. This tabernacle is prophetic of exactly how God redeems man through Christ. And we're just scratching the surface, just scratching the surface. So um, with that, I'm right at my time. So I just encourage you to join us next week. Next week we look at this part. We look at the prophetic tabernacle and where we get those numbers from. And that's the part that I'm actually excited to talk about this today, which is laying a foundation for, showing where we get the number if we go through scripture and we go through archaeology. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing this now, Sandy, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you again. I want to make note that there's a lot of people that take Mrs. White every single thing at her word, and that's not what she wanted. And she made it very clear that she was not a historian and that she got history. People talk about things that she said and somebody changed it and did this, that, and the other. That wasn't as important. Even, I don't know, maybe even in her books and stuff, she got them from history books. A lot of the stuff she didn't get from her head. I know God inspired her on many things that are very sure. But some of this stuff, like you said, she was just putting out what she read and what she thought, and
And so was Paul, so was
yep,
Luke, so was,
yep.
they were going by what they knew at the time in their records and whatever. When archaeology set up, they set to disprove Luke. And the first archaeologists were so upset because the guy came back and said, that guy's a historian to the nth degree. I mean, they found everything that he said because, of course, things changed. And what was supposed to be
Right.
here was 5 miles away because it had eroded and the sea had covered it or whatever. But when they actually looked and started unearthing things, it's exactly where Luke said it was. So, the whole thing is that is um, people might argue, and that's fine. But if you're going to talk about Ellen White, she said, present truth, new light, and she also said a message coming out of the tabernacle. And even the Seventh Day Adventist commentary didn't hold fast on the sword about the 230. They had to choose one of the two. And in the 50s, the most popular um, SDA view was the 215. And so it just chose to defend that. But even the ones that did that, they still had some doubts because it's impossible if you add in with the Septuagint and add in some things, then you can make a good case either way. The problem is you're trying to shrink that into a 4,000 year model, then it gets really wonky. So, for example, it gets okay. Well, we get to 3690, and then got to add another 20 years because probably this was forgotten, and then another 10 years so you don't really even get this even number without a bunch of special pleading, to be 4,000 years. So it just makes it all look pretty wishy-washy. So long story short is that um, I didn't know much about the Bible when I did my research on it. So it was a little bit of a blessing because I just went with the literal, what I could read, what I could observe, and I wasn't, conflicted by anything else. But like I said, you'll see next week, it doesn't matter. And my point today was, I may be talking to a Jewish audience, and I may be talking to an SDA audience. I may be talking to someone else that has different chronology, Baptist or whatever. I want everyone to feel comfortable that, okay, we don't all agree. We're kind of close, but man, what we can agree on is that man has a lot more understanding of time, both in observing time and in historic time than we ever had. So when we go to the tabernacle and look at it from today's point of view, we can see some things that were meant for our generation to see. And it doesn't have a timeline in the tabernacle. It doesn't have like Usher said this, or it just says here's a dimension. And when we look at the mercy seat, that's a picture pointing to a very specific event. And we know all the rituals that go along with it, all the ceremonial laws of the sprinkling of the blood and the one day of the year. And that's a specific picture to give us an understanding of who that's pointing towards. Then we start adding the dimensions to that. That's when it gets really exciting. So anyway,
But when there's like two or three ways to go like that, we just have to pray and seek God to ask Him to show us which opinion is the true one.
yeah,
Well, there are
the
some
thing
people
is,
that will argue because the Jews say it's 5,700 something, and it's getting closer to the sixth, and they think at sixth he'll be coming because the 7,000th year and all this stuff. So they see all these times and they're like, well, you're way past when he should have come, and other people are way too early. We have hundreds of
yeah,
years left.
let's
Well,
see,
I know with Ellen White, she said it was 40 years, till the destruction of Jerusalem when Christ made that prediction. And then people came back in and said, well, that's not exactly correct. And so they put about 40 years. And Mrs. White said that's okay because that was taken to her.
yeah, let's see. The thing is that it's about intellectual honesty. The if you Google the missing years, it's the Jewish scholars that said, "Hey, our clock isn't really historically precise. How can they say that when they know it's 587 BC, 586 BC when the temple is destroyed, and yet in their clock it says 420 BC? That's 165 years right there. So it's something where they know that. You Google it, it's not me making it up. So some people get upset when you point out the truth, but the truth is that there's that this is, if someone says, how do you get 4140? I can't be shy and go, oh, I don't want to tell you because it might offend you or whatever. No, because it's clearly from the Bible, word for word, and here's all the resources, here's all the sources. But at the same time, that's not how I got the 4140 to begin with. I didn't, when I got what happened, like I said to you last week, I had doubts about the Bible and I prayed, and I had 5 specific doubts: creation, the flood, Exodus, and the birth and resurrection of Jesus. I knew you couldn't be a Christian if you had doubts about that. And I prayed. I said, God, can you please, if it's your will, and I opened the Bible, I saw a direct link between those 5 things. And where did I see it? In the tabernacle pattern, in the genealogies, in the book of Revelation. Like I saw it in 3 different places. I thought, okay, I don't know what this is, but I know that all 5 of those things are connected somehow in this pattern, and more. I'll say later. So it got me, interested. And so as I started to work out different things or whatever, then it just kept getting more and more and more incredible and more exciting. So I didn't do that Bible timeline for about 5 years because I didn't need it. It was just later. I was curious about that number, 4140. I wonder what event this is talking about. I knew it had something to do with Jesus, but I was kind of the same impression. Everyone says 4,000 years, so 4140. What happened? Was this the start was this something to do with John? Was this the book of Revelation being written? What was this? I was actually kind of shocked to go, oh, the Bible isn't 4,000 years. It's 4,114 to 1 BC or whatever. And not because I was trying to find a number. Anyway, it's one of those things where I don't actually enjoy doing that lesson, but I need to have a foundation so that I can go forward. And next time someone says, well, where do you get the number from? I should go back to number 2 and listen to that. But what'll be more exciting is when I can say, go back to number 3 and listen to that, because I can talk at number 3 about where the pattern is in tabernacle. And that's what's the amazing part of it, is that the tabernacle is prophetic of every major event. The flood, the Exodus, all of it. And so we don't need to know, okay, is it 430 or 250? Because the tabernacle says, boom, this is when Moses is going to be born. Boom, this is going to be, it doesn't, it said, this is when something's going to happen. And it gives you a picture of what that's going to be, and it's the most amazing thing ever. But anyway,
Well, building the sanctuary, I believe that Moses followed the exact measurements. And I believe that God in
I
heaven
do too.
was overlooking it. And if there was any deviation from it, I believe Moses would have been notified to change it.
Yeah. Well, he wouldn't, it was verified when they erected it, and his presence was there so much that
Yeah,
Moses couldn't
all
even
the
enter
time.
the tabernacle because God's presence was there. Once he observed it exactly as it was supposed to, and it said, like, my presence will be with you. And when that was erected, Moses couldn't even enter. Just like when the temple was consecrated, Solomon, none of the priests could enter because the presence of God was so strong, and that signified his acceptance of the work. And so, but I always find it, because tabernacle means dwell and stuff like that. But I always find it interesting when he says, once you observe this exactly as I've given to you, I will dwell again with my people. Well, I believe, based on the tabernacle pattern and looking at when we reconstruct it, and it falls as it's completed in our generation, that's a promise saying when you finish observing this all, that's when I'm going to dwell with my people again. And my presence will be so that no man can, you know, deny it. You know, like it's the return, you know. So anyway, I just, it is what it is, you know, but I wanted to lay some foundational stuff about, you know, about time and about how we got to here, because we just assumed that, you know, time that everyone always had knew how many days or months or whatever. I mean, the secular calendar was off too. It wasn't just some timelines where biblical chronology was off. The calendar we used for 1500 years was off. You know, it got switched over to the Gregorian and whatever. And I know how upsetting, like I said, if I found out my calendar was off by 10 days, you know, where I woke up today and tomorrow's 10 days, I'd be a little upset. So if I'm basing my Bible study on a certain chronology and I find that that's off by 100 years, I'm upset too. And I'm not going to let go of that very easily. You know, it's like, no, I still think you're wrong. So that's what I said. So forget it. It doesn't really matter. Here's where I got it. You can't argue with me that it was an honest attempt to to use the Bible and everything else, including, you know, commentaries from the advances from Jewish scholars, saying that this is my best attempt as a man to reconstruct the timeline. So, you know, you can disagree with me, but you can't say it's some phony thing or whatever. What's important when you get to the, you know, the next study is a pattern is determined by, you know, goes from here to here to here. And so before you get to 4140, you have everything, you know, from Adam to Enoch to Noah to, you know, and it just happens that 4140 is the height of it, you know. So anyway, I don't want to get too you know, too off topic, but I know
Well,
you got another speaker coming in.
I think it's a definite a message for our time. And, you
Yeah,
know, it's very timely and I do appreciate it. And it's, people don't believe in the sanctuary. They don't believe in the feast. They don't believe in anything in it. And you're making it all very important and hopefully people will see it and, it will help a lot of people come
But
around.
one thing they do believe, and that was Jesus Christ was born in December 25,
yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
which we know he wasn't.
right. But it's yeah, I mean it's something where I think if me or Keith